We can now bring in Patrick Burry, Senior Lecturer in Security at the University of Bath and former British Army Captain and NATO Analyst. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us on the program today. Just yesterday, the US President Joe Biden was asked about a Ukrainian request to lift restrictions on long-range weaponry. Biden responded, "I made it clear what we prefer, what we would support, and what we don't." What do you think, in your opinion, would be permissible for Washington?
Good afternoon. I think if it's going to stay the same, and the reason that permission to use Western weapons essentially on Russian air bases inside Russia, the reason that hasn't been granted, I would be very surprised if it is. I personally can see the reasons why. Russia have found a sweet spot, a strategic sweet spot, where they can use their air forces at a standoff distance and use cheap glide bombs, which are, it doesn't make sense to be intercepting them with a very expensive Patriot missiles, etc., to bombard and destroy Ukrainian energy infrastructure, water infrastructure, and even the front lines too, because they've got dynamic targeting. So they found this spot. And of course, Ukraine, as we all know, are asking, you've got to let us shoot the Archer, not the Arrow. So hit the air bases. But Ukraine can't do that on its own at the moment. It doesn't have those weapon systems. And so they're reliant on the West, the UK, the US, France, to give them clearance to strike Russian air bases inside Russia with Western weapons. And the problem here is that there's no precedent for this between two nuclear-powered forces fighting what has become a proxy war. There's no precedent, and that's why I think the US, better minds than myself, with better intelligence, have come to the conclusion that this is too risky.
It's too risky because we have, in the past over 2 years, seen those repeated red lines being crossed by NATO allies. You're saying this is not going to happen?
That's my hunch. I think given the reticence that the US has shown here about granting this, it would have been granted if it happens. I could be wrong, but I think the other red lines, listen, Russia, and this is what plays into a lot of analysis, people saying, oh, well, Russia said this and it was a red line. And they have done a great job of using the nuclear threat as to scare off, in particular, certain European nations, to scare them off over certain things. And the aid that has gone into Ukraine from the West has been salami sliced, too little, too late, and it's had horrific consequences for the Ukrainians. A lot of that could have gone in much sooner. There is a rules of the game here. It's happened in larger conflicts previously between two nuclear armed stations, and that is, if one power invades another's ally with its full conventional forces, that ally can respond with full conventional force inside that country. So that could have been the rule of the game back when the invasion happened, that if basically Ukraine could have been given everything it needed immediately to stop Russia inside Russia. But when it escalates onto a nuclear power sovereign territory, that is what nuclear deterrence is actually for. It's about protecting your sovereign territory. So that's why I think the calculation in the US is this would actually be quite risky. Secondly, if you look, that actually there's been a reported sabotage operation on a Norwegian airbase, threats of sabotage, etc., against German Air Force bases too. This is Russia bringing out its deterrence now and saying, in my view anyway, look, we're serious about this. This will happen. You need to read the signals.
Because I want to ask you about the Kursk incursion, which started just in August, not so long ago. But in that same month, Russia has advanced some 477 square kilometers into Ukrainian territory. This is Moscow's biggest increase. This is, of course, according to data supplied by the Institute for the Study of War. So has this bet on this Kursk incursion been too risky for Volodymyr Zelensky?
It's a really good question. When it first happened, people are watching it very closely, said, what are they doing? This is too risky. You're putting in crack units, which are needed in defense, essentially, and as a reserve into Kursk. And then, given the amount of time it took the Russians to move forces around, I thought actually the Ukrainian bet had been a pretty good one. But I think the central tenet of this bet was that it would draw off forces from what you're talking about, the Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar axis, which is where they're really advancing now. And it would draw forces off. And of course, what Putin has calculated is is I am not taking forces away from my main effort. So he stripped forces out of other parts of the line. Yes, the Ukrainians were right about that assessment. The Russians are stretched, but he stripped forces from other parts of the line to deal with this, which is essentially just captured a few villages in Kursk, you know. Whereas the real risk now, unfortunately, is Pokrovsk is a major logistical hub for the like half of the front essentially down there.
Uh,
So that's the worry. He's managed to be able to not strip forces off the Pokrovsk axis.
and what happens if Ukraine does lose Pokrovsk?
It's it's not good.
It's not good
It's not good. No, it's
because
not good. I mean, it's an axis. I mean, they'll find other ways, but it depends. I actually think personally, I think that the advance on Pokrovsk may well slow down as it starts to move into the urban fight rather than the more rural fight where the Russians are advancing now.
Patrick,
Um,
we have winter that's around the corner. I mean, it is September, but in that part of the world, it gets cold a lot sooner, and then it's difficult to send in weaponry and get things moving, isn't it?
well, yeah, maybe in about 6 weeks it gets wet first, uh, and then and things slow down, and then it gets cold. So,
And
um, we'll see. Yes, it slows combat down. Of course it does. But if they need to stabilize the front down near Pokrovsk really soon because it's getting quite worrying, unfortunately, and hopefully they can.
And the incursion into Kursk, one thought in the early days was for Ukraine to have an upper hand in any potential peaceful settlement, a dialogue to bring this war to an end. But now you're saying that Kyiv could be on the back foot?
I don't in the Kursk salient essentially there's still a bit of tit for tat going on. The Russians have pushed the Ukrainians out of some villages and Ukrainians are still attacking in other places. The big question is, look, you widened your line, you widened your front line, and now you have to sustain that for Ukraine, and you put in really good units.
Hmm.
Personally, I think that it probably made the most sense in terms of the main aim would have been to have take, or one of the supporting aim, take the Kursk nuclear power plant on day one or day two, and then trade it for Zaporizhia coming up to winter, which the Russians hold. Would have made a lot of sense. But again, in these operations, surprise operations it's so difficult to know where you're going to get to on day one or day two.
Patrick Berry, fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for joining us on the
Thanks.
program today.